They say old war dogs don't get scared. They get alert, they get angry, but they don't get scared. Rex served 3 tours overseas. He's dragged men out of burning Humvees. He's faced down gunfire without flinching. But the moment Caleb Vance stepped onto the overgrown grass of his dead uncle's farm, something changed. For the first time in 10 years, Rex wasn't trying to protect Caleb. He was begging him to run. Caleb should have listened. He should have turned that truck around and never looked back. But he didn't. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a rusted iron key, and did the one thing his uncle's will explicitly forbade him to do. He unlocked the well. And from the darkness below, something knocked back. What did Caleb find in the dark? And who or what was waiting for him? Welcome to a story of loyalty, secrets, and a history that refuses to stay buried. If you love mysteries with heart and want to find out what lies beneath, please press that subscribe button and ring the bell right now. Don't leave Caleb and Rex to face this alone. 72 hours earlier, Caleb Vance didn't even know he had an inheritance coming. He was sitting in the office of Mr. Henderson, a small-town lawyer with a coffee stain on his tie and a clock on the wall that ticked just a little too loud. Caleb looked at his hands. Rough, calloused hands that had spent a lifetime working hard for very little. The VA check barely covered the rent of his studio apartment. His truck needed a new transmission, and Rex needed hip medication that Caleb couldn't afford. Your Uncle Jack was a particular man, the lawyer said, pushing a heavy iron key across the desk. It didn't look like a house key. It looked medieval. Cold, black iron, heavy enough to bruise if you threw it. The farm in West Virginia is yours, Caleb. Lock, stock, and barrel. It's not much to look at, but the land is good. Caleb reached for the key. It felt like a lifeline. A farm meant space. It meant he could sell the land, pay off his debts, maybe finally get Rex the surgery he needed. But, the lawyer interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, there is a condition, a strict one. He pointed to a highlighted paragraph in the last will and testament. I, Jack Vance, leave this property to my nephew Caleb, on the condition that the stone well in the north pasture remains sealed. The grate is not to be removed. The lock is not to be opened. What is buried there must remain asleep. Caleb frowned. Is it contaminated? Chemical waste? He didn't say, the lawyer replied, cleaning his glasses nervously. Just don't open it, Caleb. Jack was a logistics officer in the war. He was a man of order. He didn't make rules for no reason. Caleb took the key. When you're broken 62 years old, you don't argue with a free house, even if it comes with a ghost story attached. The drive to Blackwood Ridge took 6 hours. The deeper they drove into the mountains, the quieter the world became. The radio signal faded into static. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and finally to dirt. When the farmhouse came into view, Caleb's heart sank. It was a wreck. The American dream looked more like a nightmare of dry rot and termite damage. But it was theirs. Caleb parked the truck. Come on, buddy, he muttered, opening the door. New home. Rex hopped out. Usually the dog would run the perimeter, checking the fence line, marking territory. It was his routine. But today Rex froze. His nose twitched, testing the air. The fur along his spine stood up in a rigid ridge. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking past it, toward a cluster of briars and old oak trees about 50 yards away. Caleb spent the first hour just clearing a path to the back. He needed water. The plumbing in the house was dead dry, the pipes groaning with rust. He remembered the lawyer mentioning a well. If he could get the pump working, they'd have water tonight. He found it buried under 30 years of ivy. It was an old stone structure, circular and imposing, and capped with a heavy iron grate that looked like it belonged on a prison cell, not a farm well. And there in the center was the padlock. Caleb was a practical man. He respected his uncle, but he respected survival more. He had no water. He had no money to buy bottled water in town, which was 20 miles back. Sorry, Uncle Jack, Caleb whispered. A man's got a drink. He slid the iron key into the lock. It was stiff, gritty with age. Caleb had to use both hands, gritting his teeth, applying force. Click. The sound was loud in the quiet evening. The shackle popped open. Rex, down, Caleb commanded, startled. He tried to shake the dog off. What is wrong with you? Rex wouldn't let go. The dog was trembling. He was lunging, grabbing Caleb's pant leg, trying to pull him away. Caleb ignored him. He grabbed the heavy iron grate and heaved. It was incredibly heavy, scraping against the stone with a screech that sounded like a scream. He managed to slide it open just a few inches, enough to drop a pebble in to test the depth. He picked up a small stone and dropped it into the black abyss. He waited for the splash. He waited for the thud of rock hitting dry dirt. But that's not what he heard. 3 seconds passed. Then from the depths of the earth, a sound came back. Clang! Clang! It wasn't an echo, it was a response. Someone or something down there had just banged on a metal pipe. Rhythmic, deliberate, two distinct knocks. Caleb froze, his blood turning to ice water. The wind suddenly felt very cold. He grabbed the grate to slam it shut, but then he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye at the edge of the forest line, a glint of light, a reflection. Someone was watching. Caleb realized two things in that terrifying moment. First, the well wasn't a water source, and second, he and Rex were not alone on this mountain. Caleb didn't sleep in the house that first night. He couldn't. After the metallic clang echoed up from the depths of the well, and after he spotted that glint of glass in the tree line, every instinct he had honed in the service came rushing back. He slammed the heavy iron grate shut, snapped the padlock back into place, and retreated. He dragged an old mattress from the back of his pickup truck into the cab, locking both doors. It was a tight squeeze for a grown man and a 70-pound German shepherd, but neither of them complained. The truck was familiar. It smelled of old coffee, motor oil, and wet dog. It smelled like safety. The house, looming dark and silent against the indigo sky, smelled like secrets. A storm rolled in over the Blue Ridge Mountains around midnight. It was one of those heavy Appalachian summer storms where the thunder shakes the ground before you even see the lightning. Rain hammered against the metal roof of the truck like buckshot. Rex didn't sleep either. The old dog sat on the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the cool glass, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. Every time the thunder cracked, he would let out a low, vibrating growl. Not at the storm. Rex had slept through mortar fire in Kandahar, but at something out in the dark. Caleb lay with one hand on Rex's neck and the other resting on the grip of his granddaddy's Colt 1911, tucked into the seat cushion. He watched the rain blur the world outside. He kept thinking about the lawyer's words. What is buried there must remain asleep. But whatever was down there wasn't asleep. It had knocked back. Morning broke with a thick, gray fog that clung to the valley floor. The rain had stopped, leaving the world dripping and muddy. Caleb groaned as he sat up, his joints stiff from the cramped quarters. At 62, the cold mornings hit harder than they used to. He reached for the dashboard radio. It was an old CB unit, a relic from when he used to drive long-haul trucking. He keyed the mic. Sheriff Miller. Miller, you on this channel? Over. Static hissed for a moment. Then a familiar gravelly voice crackled through. Caleb, that's you? I thought you'd be halfway to Florida by now. Over. Not yet, Jim, Caleb replied, a small smile touching his lips. Jim Miller had been his platoon leader 40 years ago, and the county sheriff for the last 20. Just checking in. 0800 hours. Still breathing. Good to hear. You need anything up there at the old Vance place? I can send a deputy to run supplies if the truck gives out. I'm fine, Caleb lied. He wasn't fine. He was spooked. But in these parts, you didn't complain until you were bleeding. Just keep your radio on, Jim. The reception up here is spotty. Roger that. I'm always listening. Miller out. That radio check was a ritual, a lifeline. It was Caleb's way of telling the world he was still standing. He put the mic back, poured the last of his cold thermos coffee into a travel mug, and stepped out into the mud. The first thing he noticed was the tire tracks. The rain had washed away most of the dust, but near the gate, the mud was churned up deep. Fresh ruts. Caleb knelt, examining them. They were wide, expensive tires. Highway treads, not the mud grips the locals used on their pickups. Someone had pulled into the driveway last night, sat there with their engine idling, and then backed out. Rex trotted over to a patch of weeds near the well and started sniffing furiously. What is it, boy? Caleb asked. He walked over. Lying in the wet grass, stark white against the green, was a cigarette butt. Caleb picked it up with a handkerchief. It wasn't the cheap roll-your-own tobacco the farmers around here smoked. It was a slim, filtered brand with a gold band near the filter. A city cigarette. Someone had been standing right here, watching them sleep. Caleb looked at the well. The lock was still secure, but the ivy he had cleared yesterday had been trampled down further. "We need answers, Rex," Caleb muttered, "and I think they're inside." He finally approached the farmhouse. The front door was swollen from the damp, and he had to shoulder it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and time. Sheets covered the furniture like ghosts. Caleb moved through the rooms, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors. The kitchen was a time capsule from the 1950s. The living room was filled with books on history and military logistics. He found his uncle's study on the second floor. It was the only room that looked lived in. Papers were scattered across a heavy oak desk. There was a half-empty bottle of bourbon and a stack of unopened letters. On the wall behind the desk hung a large framed topographic map of the county. It was old, hand-drawn in ink. Caleb stepped closer, wiping the dust from the glass. He traced the property lines with his finger. There was the house, there was the barn, and there, in the north pasture, was the well. But on the map, the well wasn't labeled well. It was circled in red ink. Next to it, in his uncle's sharp, angular handwriting, were the words, "Site B, inventory incomplete. Do not open." "Site B?" Caleb whispered. "Then where is Site A?" He started shifting through the papers on the desk. Most of it was nonsense. Receipts for feed, tax documents. But tucked inside a ledger, he found a photograph. It was black and white, grainy. It showed his Uncle Jack, young and handsome in his uniform, standing in front of a cave entrance in what looked like Europe. Behind him were stacks of wooden crates stamped with the U.S. Army insignia. But it was the man standing next to Uncle Jack in the photo that made Caleb pause. He was tall, wearing a suit instead of a uniform, looking out of place among the soldiers. He had a cold, arrogant smile. Caleb flipped the photo over. On the back, written in pencil, "Jack and the Broker, Zurich, 1945. "The broker," Caleb read aloud. Suddenly, Rex barked. A sharp, warning bark from downstairs. Caleb shoved the photo into his pocket and moved to the window. He peered through the dirty glass, looking down at the driveway. A vehicle was pulling in. It wasn't a sheriff's cruiser, and it certainly wasn't a neighbor coming to say hello. It was a black, late-model Range Rover. The paint was so polished it reflected the gray clouds above. It looked like a shark swimming in a pond of minnows. It navigated the potholes with ease, creeping silently up the gravel drive. The car stopped right next to Caleb's battered Ford truck. The contrast was almost insulting. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Caleb's entire life savings, and pristine Italian leather shoes that had no business touching West Virginia mud. He adjusted his cufflinks, looked up at the house, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Caleb's hand went instinctively to his belt, but he realized he had left the Colt in the truck. He was unarmed. "Easy, Rex," Caleb whispered as the dog bounded up the stairs to stand beside him. The stranger didn't knock. He just stood there in the yard, waiting, as if he owned the place and was just waiting for the tenants to come out. Caleb took a deep breath, patted Rex's head for courage, and headed down the stairs. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing for certain. The knocking in the well, the cigarette butt, and this man in the suit, they were all connected, and none of them were here to bring good news. Caleb Vance stood on the rotting wood of his front porch, his thumbs hooked into the belt loops of his jeans. He didn't walk down to meet the stranger. In the mountains, you make people come to you. It's a matter of territory. Rex sat at Caleb's heel, his body rigid. The low rumble in the dog's chest was vibrating against Caleb's leg, a constant warning signal. The man in the charcoal suit picked his way carefully across the muddy yard. He moved like a man who was used to walking on marble floors, lifting his Italian leather loafers high to avoid the puddles. He stopped 10 feet from the porch steps, just out of reaching distance. A calculated distance. "Mr. Vance," the man called out. His voice was smooth, polished, like a radio announcer selling life insurance. "My name is Elias Thorne. I represent Meridian Heritage Partners." Caleb didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. "You're on private property, Mr. Thorne." And the gate was closed. Thorne laughed, a dry, short sound. "Gates are for cattle, Mr. Vance, not for business opportunities. I'm here to save you a lot of trouble." He reached into his jacket pocket. Caleb tensed, but Thorne only produced a pristine white business card and a leather-bound folder. He walked up the first 2 steps, holding the folder out like a peace offering. "I know about your situation, Caleb. May I call you Caleb?" Thorne didn't wait for an answer. "I know about the VA checks. I know about the back taxes your uncle owed on this place, and I know this farmhouse is, well, let's be honest, it's a teardown. You're sitting on a liability. Caleb looked down at the man. It was terrifying how much this stranger knew. In America, debt is a private shame, and having it laid bare by a stranger felt like a violation. State your business, Caleb said, his voice gravelly. I want to buy the farm, Thorne said. He opened the folder. Inside was a cashier's check. Caleb could see the numbers from where he stood. It was a check for $250,000. For a man with $80 in his checking account, that piece of paper looked like salvation. It looked like a new truck. It looked like a warm apartment in town. It looked like the hip surgery Rex desperately needed. Cash, Thorne whispered. Today, you sign the deed, you take the check, and you walk away. No cleanup required. We buy it as is. Caleb looked at the check. Then he looked at Thorne's eyes. They were gray, flat, and completely empty of warmth. Why? Caleb asked. The land's rocky. Can't grow corn here. Can't graze cattle. Why pay $250,000 for a pile of rocks? Thorne's gaze flickered over Caleb's shoulder, toward the backyard, toward the well. It was a split-second glance, but Caleb caught it. We're a conservation group, Thorne lied. The lie was smooth, but it was there. We preserve historic Appalachian sites. Your uncle's well, it has historical significance. We want to protect it. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. The well, it always came back to the well. At that moment, Rex decided to introduce himself. The big German shepherd trotted down the steps, his nose working overtime. He approached Thorne, sniffing at the man's expensive trousers. It was a standard dog greeting, checking the stranger's scent, looking for a threat. Thorne froze. His polished veneer cracked for just a second. He looked down at Rex with a mixture of fear and absolute revulsion. Get it away, Thorne hissed, stepping back. Rex, sensing the hostility, nudged Thorne's shin with his wet nose, inhaling deeply. Thorne recoiled as if he'd been burned. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and frantically wiped the spot on his pants where Rex's nose had touched. He looked at the dog like it was a giant rat. Filthy beast, Thorne muttered under his breath. It was quiet, but Caleb heard it. That was the moment the deal died. To a man like Caleb Vance, you can insult his house. You can insult his truck. You can even insult his cooking, but you never, ever look at his dog with disgust. In the lonely world of a widower veteran, the dog isn't a pet. He's the only family left. Caleb stepped down from the porch. He took the folder from Thorne's hand. He didn't look at the check. He closed the folder and shoved it back against Thorne's chest. Get off my land, Caleb said. Thorne blinked, his composure slipping. Excuse me. Did you see the number, old man? That's more money than you'll see in 3 lifetimes. I saw it, Caleb said. He rested his hand on Rex's head. But my dog don't like you, and I trust his judgment a hell of a lot more than I trust yours. Thorne's face darkened. The salesman mask vanished, replaced by something sharper, uglier. You're making a mistake, Vance. A big one. This isn't a negotiation. This is an eviction notice disguised as a gift. I know my rights, Caleb said, his voice rising. This is private property. You have 10 seconds to get back in that fancy car before I call the sheriff. And Sheriff Miller isn't as polite as I am. Thorne stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he put the handkerchief away. He smoothed his jacket. Keep the farm then, Thorne said coldly. Enjoy it while you can. But remember, Caleb, old houses are dangerous. Pipes burst. Wires spark. Accidents happen when people live alone in the woods. It was a threat, pure and simple. Thorne turned on his heel and walked back to the Range Rover. He didn't look back. He got in. The engine purred to life, and the black vehicle slid away down the driveway, disappearing into the mist. Caleb stood there until the sound of the engine faded completely. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had just turned down a fortune. He had just made an enemy of a powerful man. Did I do the right thing, Rex? Caleb asked softly. Rex looked up and licked Caleb's hand, his tail wagging once. Yes, the wag said. We stay. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. Caleb spent the afternoon reinforcing the locks on the doors. He nailed planks over the loose windows in the basement. He felt like he was preparing for a siege. Dusk fell early, bringing the shadows back out from the forest. Caleb fed Rex his dinner, dry kibble mixed with a little warm gravy, and made himself a sandwich. He sat in the living room, reading his uncle's ledger by the light of a single-floor lamp. The silence of the house was heavy. Then at exactly 8:14 p.m., the darkness took over. Sd. The floor lamp flickered once, twice, then popped. The house plunged into absolute blackness. Caleb sat frozen in the chair. Power outage, he whispered to himself. Just a blown fuse. Old wiring. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the wiring. The storm had passed. The wind was calm. He stood up, reaching for his flashlight on the table. He clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust motes in the air. Rex was standing at the front door. He wasn't barking. He was doing something much scarier. He was growling, a low guttural sound that came from deep in his throat. The hair on his back was standing straight up. Caleb walked to the window and peered out through the crack in the curtains. Down at the end of the driveway, past the gate, he saw a pair of headlights. They weren't moving. They were just sitting there, facing the house. High beams on, blindingly bright. Watching, Caleb's hand went to the small of his back, finding the reassuring weight of the Colt 1911 he had retrieved from the truck. Thorne hadn't been lying. The accidents were starting. "Come on, Rex," Caleb whispered, moving away from the window. "We're not sleeping in the bedroom tonight." He led the dog toward the basement door. If they were coming for him, he wasn't going to make it easy. He was going to dig in. But as he passed the kitchen, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. It came from the backyard, from the direction of the well. Scream! It was the sound of metal grinding on stone. Someone was out there. And they weren't knocking anymore. They were opening the grate. The screech of metal on stone cut through the night like a scream. Caleb didn't hesitate. He didn't think about his aching knees or his 62 years. He thought about the well, and he thought about the men who were trying to take what didn't belong to them. He kicked the back door open, the wood splintering against the frame. "Hey!" Caleb roared, his voice booming across the dark yard. He raised the heavy flashlight in his left hand and the Colt 1911 in his right. The beam of light slashed through the darkness, sweeping over the tall grass. It caught two figures by the well. They were dressed in dark clothes, holding crowbars. They had managed to pry the grate open about 6 inches, enough to make that god-awful sound, but not enough to get in. At the sight of the gun in the charging German shepherd, the figures didn't stick around to chat. "Go, go!" one of them shouted. They scrambled backward, tripping over the vines, and sprinted toward the tree line. Rex lunged, his teeth snapping inches from a fleeing ankle, but Caleb whistled sharply. "Rex, heel!" He couldn't risk the dog running into the woods. Who knew how many more of them were waiting in the dark? Rex skidded to a halt, barking furiously at the retreating shadows. The sound of a car engine revving up and tires spinning on gravel echoed from the road, then faded into silence. Caleb stood there in the rain-soaked grass, his chest heaving. He shined the light on the well. The lock was twisted and broken. The heavy iron grate was slightly askew. They would be back. Thorne wouldn't stop with a couple of hired thugs. Next time, they would come with bolt cutters and maybe something heavier than crowbars. "We're running out of time, buddy," Caleb whispered to Rex. He looked down at the black opening of the well. He couldn't defend the farm if he didn't know what he was defending. He had to know why a rich man in a suit was willing to threaten an old veteran for a dry hole in the ground. Caleb holstered his pistol and turned to the barn. It was time to go down. It took Caleb an hour to rig the system. He was a former combat engineer. He knew how to build things that lasted. He found a heavy-duty block and tackle in the barn, rusted but functional. He threw a climbing rope, sturdy braided nylon he kept in his truck for towing, over the sturdy oak branch that hung directly over the well. He secured one end to the winch on the front bumper of his Ford pickup and the other to a climbing harness he fashioned out of webbing. "Listen to me," Caleb said, kneeling in front of Rex. The dog was pacing nervously, whining at the edge of the well. "I need you up here. You're the lookout. If anyone comes, you bark. You understand?" Rex licked Caleb's face, his brown eyes full of worry. He sat down, placing his paws firmly on the edge of the stone rim. He was taking his post. Caleb double-checked his flashlight, clipped a radio to his belt, and lowered himself into the hole. The air inside the well was different. It didn't smell like stagnant water or rot. It smelled like cold stone and grease, a faint mechanical smell that had no business being in a natural well. As Caleb lowered himself down, the circle of moonlight above grew smaller. The walls were lined with rough fieldstones, slick with moss. 10 feet, Caleb muttered to himself, counting the descent. 15 feet. At 20 feet, his boots hit something solid. It wasn't the bottom, it was a ledge. Caleb braced his legs against the walls and shined his light downward. The well didn't end. It just stopped being a well. The rough stone masonry abruptly changed to smooth red brick. It was architectural, intentional. He swung gently on the rope, examining the brickwork. He remembered the map in his uncle's study. Site B, do not open. Uncle Jack hadn't dug a well. He had built a chimney, a hidden entrance. Caleb ran his gloved hand over the bricks. One of them, near his shoulder height, was slightly discolored. It was cleaner than the others, polished by the oil of human fingers, touching it repeatedly over the years. Caleb pressed it. Click, hiss. Pneumatics. The sound was undeniable. Hidden behind the brick wall, ancient hydraulic pistons groaned to life. A section of the curved wall, about 3 feet wide, swung inward with a heavy grind. It wasn't just a wall, it was a steel blast door disguised with a brick facing. Caleb swung himself through the opening, landing on a concrete floor. He unhooked the rope, his heart pounding in his ears. He wasn't in a cave, he was in a hallway. The air here was dry and filtered. Overhead, old industrial light fixtures hung from a low ceiling, dark and dormant. Caleb swept his flashlight beam across the walls. They were painted that specific institutional shade of pale green that the U.S. military used for everything in the 1950s. My God, Jack, Caleb whispered. What did you build down here? He walked down the corridor. It was short, ending in a single heavy steel door. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault or a fallout shelter. On the center of the door was a mechanical keypad. Not digital, this was old school. A circular dial with numbers from 0 to 99. Caleb stared at it. He needed a combination. He closed his eyes, thinking. Uncle Jack was a creature of habit. He used the same numbers for everything. His lottery tickets, his P.O. box, the service number. Every soldier remembers 2 things until the day they die. Their rifle serial number and their service number. Caleb recited his uncle's number from memory. 42850. He spun the dial. 4 right, 2 left, 8 right. He held his breath on the last turn. Clunk. The heavy tumblers inside the door fell into place with a satisfying, heavy thud. The handle spun freely. Caleb gripped the cold steel wheel and hauled it open. The door swung wide on well-oiled hinges. He stepped inside and raised his light. The room was small, about the size of a master bedroom. It was lined floor to ceiling with metal shelving units. But it wasn't food or weapons on the shelves. It was crates. Wooden crates stamped with faded black ink. Top secret, property of us Govt, European Theater 1945. Some of the crates had been pried open. Caleb walked over to the nearest one. He pulled back the protective oilcloth. Gold glinted in the flashlight beam. But it wasn't coins, it was a chalice. An intricately carved golden chalice studded with rubies the size of thumbnails. Next to it was a small painting, framed in ornate wood, a portrait of a woman that looked like it belonged in the Louvre, not in a damp hole in West Virginia. Caleb realized with a jolt what he was looking at. This wasn't just treasure, this was history. During World War II, the Nazis had stolen thousands of priceless artifacts from museums and churches across Europe. The U.S. Army had recovered them, the monuments' men units, but not everything had made it back. Rumors had always persisted about shipments that went off the books, diverted by corrupt officers or lost in the chaos of reconstruction. Uncle Jack hadn't stolen them. He had intercepted them. Caleb moved to a metal desk in the corner of the room. It was covered in dust. Lying in the center was a single manila envelope. Caleb opened it. Inside was a letter handwritten in shaky cursive. Ka! Caleb, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the wolves are at the door. I didn't take these things for myself. I took them to keep them from him, the broker. He was my commanding officer. He wanted to melt the history of the world down into gold bars to fund his own private empire. I hid them here. I spent 40 years watching over them, waiting for the day the broker died so I could return them safely. But he didn't die, Caleb. He started a company, Meridian Heritage Partners. They found me. They poisoned my coffee last week. I can feel it working. I don't have much time. You are the only one I trust. You are a soldier. You understand duty. Do not let them take this. Return it to the people. Be the guardian I couldn't be. Love Tandom, Uncle Jack. Caleb lowered the letter, his hand trembling. Mr. Thorne wasn't a developer. He was the successor. He was working for the same criminal network that Uncle Jack had been fighting for half a century. They hadn't just come for the land. They had come to erase the evidence of a 50-year-old crime, and they had murdered Jack Vance to get close to it. Sudden rage flared in Caleb's chest. It was a cold, hard anger, the kind that makes a man steady his aim. "You picked the wrong family to mess with," Caleb growled. He reached for the radio on his belt to call Sheriff Miller. He had the proof. He had the motive. It was over. "Sheriff, come in. This is Caleb. I found it. I found everything." Silence. "Sheriff?" Static. Then a voice cut through the speaker. But it wasn't the sheriff's gravelly drawl. It was smooth, polished, and dripping with malice. "Mr. Vance," came the voice of Elias Thorne, "I'm afraid the sheriff is indisposed at the moment, and you seem to be in a bit of a hole." Caleb's blood ran cold. "I hope you like the dark, Caleb," Thorne continued, "because you're going to be seeing a lot of it." From far above at the top of the well, Caleb heard a terrifying sound. The sound of the heavy iron grate slamming shut, and then the distinct click of a padlock snapping into place. He was trapped, and Rex was up there alone with them. The sound of the lock snapping shut echoed down the stone shaft like a gunshot. Caleb didn't scream. He didn't bang on the walls. Screaming wastes oxygen, and in a confined space 40 feet underground, oxygen is the only currency that matters. Instead, he stood perfectly still in the center of the bunker, his boots planted on the cold concrete floor. He took a slow, measured breath. In through the nose, hold for 4 seconds, out through the mouth. It was a technique he'd learned in basic training 40 years ago to steady his aim. Now he was using it to steady his mind. "Situation report," Caleb whispered to himself, his voice raspy in the dry air. "Entry point sealed. Hostiles on the surface. Communications compromised. Asset is alone. Rex." The thought of the dog up there, exposed and vulnerable, hit Caleb harder than the realization of his own entrapment. The radio on his belt crackled again. "Caleb, are you still there?" It was Thorne. The voice was distorted by the rock and steel between them, but the smugness was crystal clear. Caleb unclipped the radio. He pressed the transmit button, his thumb white with pressure. "I'm here, Thorne, and I know everything. I have the ledger. I have Uncle Jack's letter. You're not a businessman. You're a fence for stolen property." A dry chuckle came through the speaker. "History is written by the victors, Caleb, or in this case, the survivors. Your uncle didn't understand that. He was a hoarder. He let all this capital sit in the dark for decades out of some misguided sense of patriotism. It's not capital," Caleb snapped. "It's blood money, and you killed him for it." "Jack was an old man with a weak heart," Thorne replied dismissively. "Nature just needed a little push. Just like you, Caleb. Accidents happen on old farms. A man falls down a well. Tragically, no one finds him until the property is sold and redeveloped." Caleb looked around the room. The steel blast door he had entered through was locked. The mechanism was hydraulic. Without power or the code from the other side, it was an immovable slab of iron. He was sealed in a tomb. "You can't keep me down here forever," Caleb said. "Sheriff Miller knows I'm here." "Sheriff Miller thinks you're sleeping off a hangover," Thorne lied. "My associates intercepted his patrol car on the main road. A flat tire can take a long time to fix in the rain. No one is coming, Caleb." There was a pause, then Thorne's voice dropped, losing its polished veneer. It became cold, hard, and cruel. "Now let's talk business. I know the ledger's down there. I need it. It contains names and bank account numbers that could be inconvenient for my partners. You pass that ledger up through the grate, and maybe, just maybe, I let you climb out." "Go to hell," Caleb said. "I thought you might say that," Thorne sighed. "Motivation is required. Boys, let him hear it." There was a shuffling sound on the radio, the sound of the microphone being moved, then a sound that stopped Caleb's heart. Barking. It was Rex. But it wasn't the deep, warning bark of a guard dog. It was the frantic, snarling bark of a dog being cornered. "That's a German shepherd, isn't it?" Thorne mused. "Beautiful animal, loyal, but old. I wonder how fast he can run. My security team has orders to sanitize the site. That means no witnesses. 2 legs, or 4. Caleb slammed his fist against the metal desk, sending a cloud of dust into the air. "Don't you touch him! You hear me, Thorne? You touch that dog and I will bury you." "Then give me the ledger," Thorne shouted back. "You have 5 minutes to decide, old man. Either you toss the book up or I turn my men loose. The clock starts now." The radio clicked off. Caleb stared at the device in his hand, his whole body trembling with rage. He wasn't afraid of dying in this hole. He was a soldier. He had made his peace with death a long time ago. But the thought of Rex, his only friend, the creature that had licked the tears from his face when his wife died, being hunted down like a wild animal, that was unbearable. He looked frantically around the room. There had to be a way out, or at least a way to help. He scanned the ceiling. The bunker was built in the 1950s. It needed air circulation. There, in the far corner of the room, hidden behind a stack of crates containing stolen French tapestries, was a metal pipe running vertically up the wall. It was about 6 inches in diameter. Too small for a man, too small for a child, but it went up. It was an air intake vent. Caleb scrambled over the crates, ignoring the priceless artifacts he was stepping on. He reached the pipe. It disappeared into the concrete ceiling. He put his ear against the cold metal. He could hear the wind. It led to the surface. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the tool bench and banged on the pipe. Clang, clang, clang. "Rex!" Caleb screamed into the vent. "Rex, listen to me!" 40 feet above, on the rain-soaked grass, the situation was deteriorating. 2 men in tactical gear were advancing on the well, holding catch poles and tranquilizer rifles. But they weren't looking to tranquilize. One of them had a pistol unholstered. Rex was crouched low near the oak tree. His lips were pulled back, exposing teeth that were worn down but still dangerous. He was terrified, but he wouldn't leave the spot. His master was in the hole. His job was to guard the hole. Then a sound vibrated through the ground. A metallic ringing coming from the old ventilation cap hidden in the bushes nearby. Clang, clang. Rex's ears swiveled. He knew that rhythm. Rex. The voice was faint, tinny, and echoing like a ghost, but Rex knew it. It was Caleb. Rex abandoned his standoff with the men. He dashed toward the bushes, where the mushroom-shaped vent cap poked out of the ground. He whined, scratching at the metal, trying to get to the voice. Down in the bunker, Caleb heard the scratching. Tears welled up in his eyes. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here," Caleb choked out. He pressed his face against the pipe. He had to make the hardest choice of his life. If Rex stayed here, he would die. Thorne's men would shoot him. The only way to save the dog was to send him away, to break the one rule of the K9 unit. Never leave your partner. "Rex, listen to me," Caleb commanded, his voice cracking into a sob. He switched to his command voice, the tone he used for serious work. "Rex, go!" Above ground, Rex froze. He heard the command, "Go." It meant leave. It meant abandon the position. He whined again, a high-pitched protest. He didn't want to go. "Go!" Caleb screamed up the pipe, banging the wrench again. "Get out of here! Go!" The desperation in Caleb's voice cut through the dog's instinct to stay. Rex understood urgency. He understood that this order was non-negotiable. Footsteps were crunching on the gravel behind him. The men were getting closer. "There's the mutt! Over by the vent!" Rex looked at the vent one last time. Then he looked at the dark tree line. He made his choice. Rex turned and bolted. He didn't run with the stiffness of an old dog. He ran with the adrenaline of a soldier under fire. He exploded out of the bushes, a blur of black and tan fur. "Shoot it!" one of the men yelled. Bang. A gunshot cracked through the night air. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from Rex's back paws. But Rex was gone. He vanished into the dense underbrush of the West Virginia forest, swallowed by the shadows. Down in the bunker, Caleb heard the gunshot. He squeezed his eyes shut, sliding down the wall until he hit the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. "Run, buddy," Caleb whispered into the silence of the tomb. "Run like hell." He was alone now, trapped in a concrete box with a dying flashlight and the stolen wealth of a continent. The oxygen was limited. The enemy was above. But Caleb Vance stopped crying. He stood up. He looked at the heavy steel door. He looked at the crates of explosives his uncle had stored on the bottom shelf. Demolition charges from 1945. If Thorne wanted to come down here, Caleb was going to make sure he regretted it. But first, he had to hope that an old dog could remember the way to town. The woods of West Virginia are not like other woods. In the daylight, they are beautiful, rolling green hills and ancient oaks. But at night, under the cover of a storm, they become a labyrinth of briars, steep ravines, and shadows that seem to move on their own. Rex hit the tree line at full speed. He was 12 years old. In dog years, he was an old man. His hips, stiff with arthritis, screamed in protest with every stride. But Rex pushed through the pain. He was running on adrenaline and training. Behind him, the flashlight beams of Thorne's mercenaries cut through the rain like lightsabers. They were sweeping the brush, looking for the black and tan shape that had defied them. "Over there! I heard twigs snapping!" one voice shouted, the sound muffled by the wet leaves. Rex didn't bark. Silence was survival. He scrambled down a muddy embankment, sliding on his belly into a shallow ravine filled with rhododendrons. The cold mud packed into his fur, masking his scent. He pressed himself flat against the earth, his breathing rapid and shallow. Above him, on the ridge, heavy boots crunched on the gravel. "I can't see a damn thing," a man grumbled. "He's gone." "Boss said to kill it," another voice replied. "If that dog gets to a neighbor, it's miles to the nearest house. And look at this terrain. That mud is half crippled. The coyotes will get him before morning. Let's get back. I want to see what's in the hole." The beams of light lingered for a moment longer, sweeping right over Rex's hiding spot before turning back toward the farmhouse. Rex waited. He waited until the footsteps faded. He waited until the only sound was the dripping of water from the canopy above. Only then did he stand up. He shook the mud from his coat. He looked back toward the farmhouse where the faint glow of the security light illuminated the well. His master was down there. Every instinct in his loyal heart told him to go back, to fight, to bite, to die protecting his handler. But the command had been clear. Go. In the K9 world, a command is absolute. Caleb had given him a mission. Rex turned his back on the farm and began to limp through the dark forest. He didn't run aimlessly. He put his nose to the wind. He smelled pine needles. He smelled wet deer. And faintly, drifting on the breeze from the east, he smelled asphalt and gasoline. The road. 40 feet underground, the air was getting heavy. Caleb Vance sat on the concrete floor of the bunker, his back resting against a crate labeled "Stolen Goods, Paris, 1944. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the cold reality of physics. This bunker was airtight. It was designed to survive a nuclear blast, which meant it was sealed tight. Without the ventilation system running, which he assumed Thorne had blocked or disabled, he had maybe 6 hours of breathable air left. He looked at his watch, 9:45 p.m. "Think, Caleb," he whispered. His voice sounded flat in the dead air. "You're an engineer. You don't die in a box. You build a way out." He stood up, forcing his tired legs to work. He swept the flashlight beam around the room again, looking not at the treasure, but at the infrastructure. The room was powered by an old generator system, currently dead, but the wiring was still in the walls. Caleb moved to the metal workbench in the corner. Uncle Jack had been a tinkerer. The bench was covered in tools from the 1950s. Heavy iron wrenches, coils of copper wire, old fuses. And there on the bottom shelf sat a wooden box painted red. Caleb knelt and opened it. Inside were sticks of what looked like clay wrapped in wax paper. Blasting caps and dummy charges. They weren't live dynamite. The chemicals would have degraded years ago into instability. But the detonators, the electric blasting caps, might still have a spark in them. An idea began to form in Caleb's mind. It was desperate, it was dangerous, but it was better than suffocating. If Thorne thought Caleb was helpless, Thorne would eventually open the door to retrieve the ledger. He wouldn't open it if he thought Caleb was armed, but he would open it if he thought Caleb was dead. Or if he thought the bunker was about to self-destruct. Caleb grabbed a coil of wire and a handful of old light bulbs from a drawer. He began to strip the insulation off the wire with his pocket knife. His hands were steady. This was work he understood. "You want the treasure, Thorne?" Caleb muttered, twisting 2 copper strands together. "I'm going to give you a light show." He worked quickly, rigging the sockets. He wasn't building a bomb. He didn't want to bring the ceiling down on his own head. He was building a flashbang. He was going to rig the main electrical panel so that when, or if, the power was restored, or if he shorted the battery array he found in the corner, it would blow every light bulb in the room simultaneously with a deafening pop and a shower of sparks. It would sound like a cave-in. It would sound like the end of the world. It was a bluff, a poker play. "One chance," Caleb said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I get one chance to surprise them." He sat back down to wait. The silence returned. He touched the photo of his wife he kept in his wallet. Then he touched the empty spot on the floor where Rex should have been. "Make it, buddy," he whispered. "Just make it to the road." Rex was tired. The woods were cruel to an old dog. Briars tore at his ears. He slipped on wet shale, sliding down a steep bank and twisting his bad hip. He whimpered, a soft sound that the wind carried away. He stopped to rest near a creek bed. He lapped up the muddy water. His legs were trembling. He wanted to lie down. The moss was soft, and sleep was calling him. Go! The voice in his head was loud. He remembered the training days. He remembered the obstacle courses at the base. Caleb running beside him, cheering him on. Over the wall, Rex! Let's go, boy! Rex stood up. He shook the water from his coat. He scrambled up the other side of the ravine. And then through the trees, he saw it. A break in the canopy. A long gray ribbon cutting through the forest. The county road. Rex limped onto the asphalt. It was still warm from the day's sun. The sensation of the hard surface under his paws felt like victory. He knew this road. This was the road they took in the truck. This was the road to town, to the vet, to the sheriff's office where Caleb sometimes stopped for coffee. Rex started to trot down the center line. Suddenly, lights swept around the curve ahead. Twin beams of yellow light cutting through the mist. An engine roared. Not the smooth hum of Thorne's Range Rover, but the rattle and clank of a heavy vehicle. Rex stopped. He stood squarely in the middle of the lane. Most dogs would run, a deer would freeze. But Rex was a K9. He didn't run from patrol cars. He ran to them. He planted his feet. He let out a bark, deep, commanding, and desperate. The vehicle was moving fast, too fast for the wet curve. The driver slammed on the brakes. Tires screeched on the wet blacktop. The vehicle swerved, fishtailing slightly, the headlights swinging wildly across the trees before coming to a halt just 10 feet from the dog. It was a sheriff's cruiser. The door flew open. A large man in a tan uniform stepped out, his hand resting on his holster, a flashlight in his other hand. What in the hell? The sheriff muttered. He shined the light on the dog. Rex didn't retreat. He barked again, then turned and ran a few steps back the way he came. Then he stopped and looked back. Follow me. Sheriff Jim Miller narrowed his eyes. He recognized the markings. He recognized the limp. Rex, Miller said, his voice filled with disbelief. Rex, what are you doing out here? Rex barked again, frantic now. He ran back to the sheriff, grabbed the man's pant leg gently with his teeth, and pulled. Miller looked at the empty road behind the dog. No truck, no Caleb. Miller felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been driving out to the Vance farm because Caleb had missed their morning radio check, something the old soldier hadn't done in 20 years. Where's Caleb? Miller asked the dog. Rex whined and looked toward the dark woods, toward the distant ridge where the farm lay hidden. Miller wasn't a man who believed in Lassie movies, but he was a man who knew that Caleb Vance would never, ever let his dog walk 5 miles alone on a highway at night, unless he couldn't stop him. Miller reached into his car and grabbed his shotgun. He clicked the radio on his shoulder. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Miller. I'm at mile marker 14. I found Caleb Vance's dog. The animal is distressed and alone. I'm proceeding to the Vance property. Code 3. Send backup. Now. He looked at Rex. All right, soldier, Miller said, racking the slide of his shotgun. Show me. Rex didn't need to be told twice. He turned and began to run back into the dark, leading the law toward the farm. Back at the well, Elias Thorne checked his Rolex. It's been an hour, he said to his men. The air is getting thin down there. Open it up. You think he's ready to talk? One of the mercenaries asked, picking up a bolt cutter. Thorne smiled. I think he's ready to beg. The mercenary snapped the new padlock Thorne had placed on the grate. He heaved the heavy iron lid open. Thorne leaned over the black hole. Caleb, he shouted, are you feeling lightheaded yet? Silence. Caleb. From the bottom of the well, a voice drifted up. It sounded weak, breathless. Thorne, Caleb gasped. Help! Thorne smirked. Drop the rope, he ordered his men. We have him. They lowered the rope. Down in the dark, Caleb watched the rope snake down toward him. He wasn't gasping. He was standing perfectly straight, holding 2 bare copper wires in his hands, standing next to the open electrical panel. Come on down, Caleb whispered, his eyes hard as flint. I've got a surprise for you. The rope dangled in the center of the bunker, swaying gently like a pendulum. 40 feet underground, Caleb Vance watched it with the intensity of a sniper waiting for a target. He was crouched behind the heavy metal desk, his breathing shallow. In his hands, he held the stripped ends of the copper wires connected to the main breaker box. He had loosened every bulb in the overhead fixtures just enough so they would arc, and he had bypassed the fuse. When he touched these wires together, he wasn't just turning the lights on. He was creating a localized lightning storm. Above him, the voice of the mercenary echoed down the shaft. I see him. He's on the floor, looks passed out. Grab him, Thorne's voice ordered from the surface, and secure the ledger first. Heavy boots scrapped against the brick walls as the mercenary rappelled down. He was coming fast. Caleb counted the seconds. 3, 2, 1. The mercenary's boots hit the concrete floor. Now, Caleb whispered. He touched the copper wires together. Zzz crack. The sound was deafening in the confined space, louder than a gunshot. A massive blue-white spark exploded from the breaker box. Simultaneously, the 4 industrial light fixtures in the ceiling surged with 10 times their rated voltage and exploded. Glass showered down like rain. The room was bathed in a blinding, strobe light flash of electrical fire, followed instantly by absolute pitch darkness. The mercenary screamed, blinded and disoriented. My eyes, I can't see! Caleb didn't wait. He moved in the dark, a space he knew intimately now. He swung the heavy iron wrench he had been holding. It connected with the mercenary's knee. The man went down with a grunt of agony. Don't move, Caleb growled, pressing the cold muzzle of the man's own dropped pistol against his neck. Or you stay down here forever. On the surface, chaos had erupted. What was that? Thorne yelled, backing away from the well as smoke billowed up from the grate. Report! What happened? We lost contact, his second man shouted, raising his rifle toward the well opening. I think he blew the charges. Thorne's face twisted in fury. Flush him out! Drop a grenade down there! The second mercenary reached for his belt, but before he could pull the pin, a new sound cut through the night. Not an explosion, not a scream, a siren. It started low, a growl in the distance, and then ramped up into a wail that tore through the quiet valley. Thorne spun around. Police, let's go, leave him. He sprinted toward his Range Rover. The mercenary abandoned the well and ran for the driver's side, but they were too late. Sheriff Jim Miller's cruiser didn't come up the driveway politely. He roared through the open gate, his high beams blinding the men near the house. He didn't hit the brakes until he was 20 yards away, slewing the heavy car sideways to use the engine block as cover. Sheriff's Department, Miller's voice boomed over the cruiser's PA system. Drop the weapons. Do it now. The mercenary raised his rifle. Miller didn't hesitate. He fired a single warning shot from his shotgun into the air. Kaboom. The next one doesn't miss, son, Miller shouted, stepping out from behind his door. Put it on the ground. Thorne froze, his hand on the door handle of his luxury SUV. He looked at the sheriff, then at the woods. He was calculating. He could run. The sheriff was an old man, heavy set. Thorne was younger, faster. Thorne bolted. He abandoned his car and his men, sprinting toward the darkness of the cornfield. I got a runner, Miller shouted. But Miller didn't run. He simply opened the back door of his cruiser. Rex, Miller said calmly. Get him. Rex didn't need to be told twice. The German Shepherd exploded from the back seat. He had been waiting for this. He had run 5 miles on bad hips. He was exhausted, wet, and in pain. But looking at the man who had tried to kill his master, Rex felt no pain. He felt only duty. He closed the distance in seconds. Thorne heard the paws pounding the mud behind him. He turned, pulling a small pistol from his ankle holster. He never got a shot off. Rex launched himself. 70 pounds of angry muscle hit Thorne square in the chest. Thorne went down hard. The breath knocked out of him. The gun flew into the tall grass. Before Thorne could scramble up, Rex was on top of him. The dog didn't bite. He didn't maul. He did exactly what he was trained to do. He stood over the suspect, his teeth bared inches from Thorne's throat, issuing a deep, terrifying bark that shook Thorne to his bones. Good boy, Rex. Hold him, Miller yelled, jogging up with his cuffs out. Thorne lay in the mud, staring up into the jaws of the animal he had called a filthy beast. He didn't dare move a muscle. 10 minutes later, the scene was secure. Thorne and his 2 mercenaries were handcuffed and stuffed into the back of Miller's cruiser and a second deputy's car that had just arrived. Miller walked to the edge of the well. Smoke was still drifting up. Caleb, Miller shouted down. You alive down there, you stubborn old mule? Silence, then a cough. I'm here, Jim. Caleb's voice floated up, sounding weary but steady. But the winch is busted. You're going to have to pull me up the hard way. Hold on, we're dropping a line. It took 3 deputies to haul Caleb up. When his head finally cleared the rim of the well, he looked like a ghost. He was covered in brick dust, grease, and sweat. His hands were bleeding. Miller grabbed his friend's arm and hauled him over the edge onto the grass. Caleb collapsed, sitting heavily on the wet ground, gulping in the fresh night air. You look like hell, Caleb, Miller said, grinning. You're late, Caleb rasped, managing a weak smile. I'm not late, Miller corrected him, his face turning serious. You missed the morning check-in, Caleb. 0800 hours. You haven't missed a check-in since 1999. I knew something was wrong. Caleb nodded slowly. The routine, the discipline, the small habits that everyone else thought were paranoid had just saved his life. Where is he? Caleb asked, looking around frantically. Where's Rex? Right behind you. Caleb turned. Rex was sitting by the cruiser, watching the prisoners with intense focus. But the moment he heard his name, the guard dog vanished and the puppy returned. He trotted over, his tail wagging so hard his whole back half shook. He shoved his wet nose into Caleb's neck, whining softly. Caleb buried his face in the dog's thick, wet fur. He hugged him tight, not caring about the mud or the deputies watching. His shoulders shook. I'm sorry I sent you away, buddy, Caleb whispered into the fur. I had to. Rex licked the soot off Caleb's cheek. He didn't care about apologies. The pack was back together. That was all that mattered. Miller knelt beside them. We found the ledger in the Range Rover, Caleb, and enough stolen art in that hole to put Thorne away for life. Federal agents are already on their way from D.C. Caleb looked up at the sheriff. He killed Uncle Jack, Jim. It's in the letter. We know, Miller said softly. We found the poison in his glove box. He was arrogant enough to keep it. It's over, Caleb. You did it. Caleb looked at the farmhouse, dark and battered against the night sky. He looked at the well, now a crime scene taped off with yellow plastic. I didn't do it for the treasure, Caleb said quietly, scratching Rex behind the ears. I did it because he tried to hurt my dog. Miller chuckled, standing up and offering Caleb a hand. Well, knowing you, that's plenty of motive. Come on, let's get you to the hospital. And I think Rex here deserves a steak. Rare. Caleb took the hand and stood up. He leaned heavily on his friend, his bad leg finally giving out. But as he limped toward the ambulance, Rex walked right beside him, matching his pace, his shoulder pressing against Caleb's leg to support him. The silent watcher had done his job. The secret was out. But the real story, the story of what came next, was just beginning. Spring comes late to the Blue Ridge Mountains, but when it arrives, it hits all at once. The gray, skeletal trees of winter burst into a canopy of vibrant green, and the wildflowers reclaim the rocky soil. The Vance farm didn't look like a haunted house anymore. The rotting siding had been replaced and painted a warm, creamy white. The sagging porch had been jacked up and reinforced with fresh pine. The yard, once a jungle of briars and mud, was now manicured grass, bordered by beds of blooming azaleas. But the biggest change wasn't the house, it was the noise. The farm wasn't silent anymore. Easy, Duke, easy now, big fella. Caleb Vance stood in the middle of the north pasture, holding a tennis ball. He wasn't wearing his faded flannel and muddy boots. He looked younger, healthier. He wore a clean polo shirt and the sturdy work boots that didn't have holes in the soles. Bounding toward him was Duke, a retired chocolate Labrador who had spent 8 years sniffing for narcotics at Miami International Airport. Duke was blind in one eye and deaf in one ear, but he could still smell a tennis ball from a mile away. Duke wasn't alone. Scattered across the fenced-in acre were 6 other dogs. There was Bella, a Malinois with 3 legs who had served in Iraq. There was Buster, a beagle who had retired from the USDA, and presiding over them all, lying on the porch like a king on his throne, was Rex. Rex looked different too. The limp was gone. Thanks to the surgery Caleb could finally afford, the old German shepherd moved with a fluid grace he hadn't possessed in years. He wasn't patrolling anymore. He was supervising. Caleb threw the ball. Duke scrambled after it, barking joyfully. Caleb wiped his brow and smiled. It was a smile that reached his eyes, something that hadn't happened in a long time. The transition hadn't been overnight. After the arrest of Elias Thorne, the farm had been swarming with federal agents for weeks. The treasure in the bunker, the paintings, the gold chalices, the statues, was cataloged and crated up. It was front-page news across America. West Virginia veteran recovers stolen Pablo II masterpieces. They called Caleb a hero. They interviewed him on the morning news. But Caleb didn't care about the fame. He cared about the result. The Treasury Department had been true to their word. Under the treasure trove laws and the federal finder's fee regulations for recovered government property, Caleb was awarded a percentage of the recovered value. It wasn't billions. He didn't buy a private island. But the check that arrived in the mail 3 months ago was enough to pay off every dime of debt Uncle Jack had left behind. It was enough to fix the truck, fix the house, and fix Rex's hips. And there was enough left over for one crazy idea. Caleb walked back toward the house, Duke trotting happily beside him. He stopped at the newly paved driveway to admire the sign hanging over the gate. Hand-carved from local oak, the letters were burned deep into the wood. The Guardian Sanctuary Rest and Rehabilitation for Retired K-9 Heroes. Caleb had realized something in that dark hole. He wasn't the only one who had been discarded after his service was done. There were hundreds of dogs, police dogs, military dogs, TSA dogs, who were too old to work, too traumatized to be normal pets, and too expensive for most families to maintain. They needed a place to go. A place where the loud noises of the city didn't scare them. A place where they could just be dogs. "Hey, Caleb!" A familiar cruiser pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Jim Miller stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town. "Morning, Jim," Caleb waved. "You checking up on me again?" "Just making sure you haven't adopted any more strays," Miller laughed, handing Caleb a cup. "Though I see you've got a full house." "Just got a call from a handler in D.C., Caleb said, taking a sip. "They've got a bomb sniffer retiring next week. PTSD. Can't handle fireworks. I told them to bring him down." Miller shook his head in admiration. "You know, most people would have taken that money and bought a condo in Florida. You bought a zoo." "I didn't buy a zoo, Jim," Caleb said, looking at Rex on the porch. "I bought a family." They walked up to the porch and sat in the new rocking chairs. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the valley. The well, the source of all the trouble, was gone. Caleb had filled it in with concrete, capped it, and planted a young oak tree right on top of it. The roots would grow deep. The past was buried, but new life was growing from it. "Thorne's trial starts next week," Miller mentioned quietly. "The feds say he's looking at 20 years. Racketeering, attempted murder, theft of government property. He won't be bothering anyone ever again." Caleb nodded. "Good, let him rot." He didn't feel angry anymore. He felt peace. Rex stood up, stretched, and walked over to Caleb. He rested his heavy head on Caleb's knee, letting out a long, contented sigh. Caleb ran his hand through the thick fur. He thought about the night in the bunker. He thought about the choice he had made to send Rex away, and the choice Rex had made to bring help back. Uncle Jack had left him a fortune, but not in the way he intended. The gold was gone. The money was just paper. The real inheritance was right here, under his hand. It was the unconditional love of a creature that would cross fire and flood just to be by his side. "You know," Caleb said softly, looking out at the dogs playing in the yard. "Uncle Jack wrote that he was guarding the treasure. He spent his whole life afraid someone would take it. He was a good man, Caleb. Just burdened," Miller said. "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "But he was wrong about one thing. You don't guard treasure by hiding it in the dark. You honor it by bringing it into the light." He looked down at Rex. "And some treasures," Caleb smiled, "don't need to be buried at all." The sun dipped below the ridge. The fireflies began to blink in the tall grass, mimicking the stars above. The house that had once been a place of fear was now warm, bright, and full of life. Caleb Vance, the lonely old soldier, wasn't lonely anymore. He was the commander of the Guardians. And as he sat there with his best friend, listening to the mountain breeze, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Home. And that brings us to the end of Caleb and Rex's journey. From a terrifying discovery in a dark well to a beautiful sanctuary filled with hope, they proved that it's never too late to find a new purpose in life. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this adventure. I know many of you watching have your own Rex at home, a loyal friend who stays by your side no matter what. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Do you believe that animals are sent into our lives to heal us? And if you could open a sanctuary like Caleb did, what kind of animals would you rescue? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear your stories. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with a friend who loves dogs. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so we can tell more stories together. Until next time, hug your furry friends tight for me. Goodbye.